Please welcome Dr. Desmond Ford.
It is very amazing how much there is in the Bible about food. We don't mind that. We're glad that God invented flavours just as He invented colours and melodies. But the first Bible chapter mentions food, the last Bible chapter mentions food, and in between the many feasts, Israel had lots of feasts. Even the new moons were a mini feast for Israel. One of the central books of the Bible, Esther, begins with a feast, and you'll never guess how long it lasted. It lasted 6 months. Every small boy would have loved to have been at that feast. In the middle of that same book, another feast, Esther and the king and the villain of the piece. Then at the end of the book, a feast that is carried on today. Purim comes from the word pure, P-U-R, which means the lot, the time when the lot was cast about the destiny of Israel in the days of Esther. Jesus loved to tell stories about feasts. But I want to think with you upon one particular feast that began the compression of 2,000 years in 24 hours. Before I do that, let me try and bring us all up to date about food in the 21st century. Food has changed more in the last 50 years than all preceding millennia. We need to know that. 10,000 chemicals have been added to our food since the beginning of last century. And it's very strange, but people always or usually care more about how they taste than how they feel. It's really a little slice of insanity. But we're all tempted the same way, to care more about how we taste than how we feel. In America, 1 in every 4 Americans goes daily to a fast food restaurant. In 1970, the income for fast food restaurants was $1 billion. Now it is $100 billion. Well, that's today. We're going to go back 2,000 years to a feast that began 2,000 years of time compressed into one day. Would you look with me, please, at John 6? This is the only miracle that's told in all 4 Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. Actually, there were about 20,000. The 5,000 were men, 5,000 women, probably twice that number of children. So we're talking about a feast for 20,000 people. And it wasn't a feast the way we would think of a feast. It was a feast of barley bread and sardines. And barley bread was food for horses. But when people are hungry, the simplest food can seem a feast. The background of this story is that the disciples have been away from Jesus for many days, preaching, teaching, healing, and now they've come back to tell him all about it, and he has some things to say to them. Herod has just killed John the Baptist, and Jesus is aware that Herod will be after him next. So he decides to take a holiday for one day, and with the disciples to whom he wants to talk, they cross the Sea of Galilee to a desert place in the north. Sea of Galilee is 14 miles long by 9 miles broad in the most broad place. And they find a mountain there and sit down because Jesus had said to them, "Come ye yourselves apart and rest a while." When Jesus told the disciples that the harvest was great and the labourers were few, he did not urge upon them the necessity of ceaseless toil. Instead he said, "Pray ye therefore, the Lord of the harvest will raise up labourers." So he cares for us physically. And now they're going to have a little holiday. Oh no, the crowds have seen them depart. And now people are streaming, some in boats, some walking, crowds upon crowds upon crowds, until the shore where the disciples and Jesus had landed is full of people. Jesus could have been impatient. He could have been upset. He was a pleasant Sunday afternoon with his friends, being spoiled by curious crowds. But the scripture says he had compassion on them. And so he goes down from the mountain to meet them. I want to read with you what it says. Verse 5 on, chapter 6 of John's Gospel. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him. He already had in mind what he's going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy, 5 small barley loaves, 5 buns, 2 small fish, sardines. How far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they'd all had enough, he said to the disciples, "Gather up the broken fragments that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who'd eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him a king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself, and with a severity he'd never before exercised, he ordered the disciples to take the boat and go, because they were caught up in it too. So here's a day where he's taught all day, spent the whole day healing. Here are thousands of women, some of them with little children in their arms, others with children plucking at their skirts. Here are men that are very hungry now. Some of them have walked miles to get there, and they've been standing all day listening to Jesus. And Jesus himself must have been pale and weary after all these hours of teaching and healing. But he saw a tragedy looming. This was a dividing point in his ministry. Soon there'd be what was known as the crisis, when many of his disciples would go back and walk no more with him. Jesus realises that of all these thousands of people, most of them will choose to starve their hearts rather than to receive the bread of life, him. He's broken-hearted. Xerxes, great king of Medo-Persia, is said to have once wept when he looked at the host of his soldiers, young men, and thought that soon they'd be sleeping in the dust. Well, Jesus may have felt a bit like that. And here are the people determined to make him a king. But he can't be a king till he's been a priest. He's already been prophet, priest, and king. So he sends the disciples off, tells the crowd to disperse, and he himself goes back up the mountain to pray. The disciples get in their boat, but a storm is gathering. And they had a storm in their own hearts because they were wondering, why didn't Jesus accept kingship so that they wouldn't feel despised and rejected? Why didn't Jesus take the opportunity to declare himself So the disciples are somewhat upset and troubled, and God gives them something else to think about. A storm comes upon the lake, and they are rowing for up to 7 hours and getting nowhere. And now it's very, very dark, very, very dangerous. Sea of Galilee is 600 feet below sea level, and it's prone to great storms, very dangerous for those that are there. When they're despairing, they see a light, and it draws nearer and nearer, and they're scared. Perhaps it's a demon, but as the light gets nearer, they see it's Jesus. And he speaks to them, he says, "Be of good cheer, it's me, don't be afraid." And the record says that when he got into the ship, immediately it was at the land. Well, what has that got to do with 2,000 years? This miracle was a text for the sermon that followed when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." You imagine a young carpenter from Nazareth standing up saying he could feed the hearts of the world. Him, carpenter's boy. But I want you to think of the miracle that's in the story. You know, a lot of people are allergic to miracles. Many people are atheists because of the Bible miracles. They forget several things. A lot of people think there are miracles all the way through the Bible. No, no, no. Many, many books in the Bible without a single miracle. There are only 3 crisis periods in the Bible where there are clusters of miracles. The 4th one is yet to come at the end of time, when good and evil miracles will flood the world. But there are only 3 periods in the Bible where there are clusters of miracles. First, the Exodus movement, the 10 plagues upon Egypt, which may have used some natural factors of that land, but had a miraculous touch, including the death blow to Pharaoh's firstborn son. Parting of the Red Sea, the drowning of Pharaoh's hosts, bestowal of the manna. There was a feast that continued for 40 years, and that was a miracle. So that's the Exodus movement, cluster of miracles. Then in the days of Elijah and Elisha, when Israel was going down rapidly, it looked as though God's people were finished. They were so much into idolatry. But we have Elijah comes along and he works about 8 miracles, and then Elisha, who's prayed for a double portion of the Spirit, he works twice as many. That's the second crisis period in the Bible. The third one is the coming of Christ, and he healed wonderfully. You know, if you pick up an old book like Grimm's Fairy Tales, the miracles aren't like the miracles of the Bible. Animals talk, men turn into animals, animals turn into men, trees talk, men become trees, great ships become goddesses, and magic rings bring forth feasts in the desert. That's what you read in Grimm's Fairy Tales. Nothing like that in the Bible miracles. All the Bible miracles fall into one of 2 categories. They're either the miracles of the old creation, the world as we now know it, or they're miracles of the new creation, the world we will one day know. For example, Christ performed 3 feast miracles. Turned water into wine at a wedding festival, feeds 5,000, 20,000 probably. Another time he feeds 4,000, and it's very interesting. He fed the greater number when he had less to start with, and he had more left over than when he had more to start with, feeding a smaller number and had less left over. Are you with me? When he had less to start with, 5 loaves and 2 fishes, 5 bread buns, 2 fishes, he feeds about 20,000. When he had more to start with, about 7 loaves and several fish, he feeds less. When he starts with least, he has more left over. As many baskets full as there are disciples, 12. When he feeds a smaller group, though he started with much more, he's got less left over. I wonder how much he could have fed with a crumb. It's as though Jesus does most with the little. He's always interested in the littles, whether it's the tears of a boy in the river of Egypt, the Nile, that attract the attention of the daughter of Pharaoh, so that Moses is drawn out. That's the meaning of Moses, drawn out. And he becomes the deliverer of Israel. The man who 40 years was learning to be somebody in Pharaoh's court, then 40 years learning to be nobody in the desert when he had to flee, then 40 years leading the people of God, and then hale and hearty because of his mistakes. He falls asleep on the borders of the promised land. So we have 3 sets of miracles, and they are not what many people think they are. The miracles of Christ, such as the 3 I've particularly stressed, water to wine, bread and fish multiplied for the thousands, well, God's doing that all the time in the old creation. Isn't it strange we take for granted the fertility of a seed? You and I are here because of a seed. Seed that multiplied itself 2 billion times in 9 months. If it keep on multiplying the same way, we'd have filled the world. But it knew when to stop. Why isn't a seed sterile like a stone? What is the difference between a seed and a stone? Well, you say, seed has life, fertile. How come? Here's an acorn. It'll bring forth an oak. Oh no, it'll bring forth forests of oaks, because from that acorn will come a tree which will have more acorns, who will bring forth more oaks, which will bring forth more acorns, and so on. The miracles of the old creation must not be taken for granted. Every harvest season all around the world, the grains are gathered in, whether it's wheat or barley or oats, all from these miraculous seeds that are fertile. It is only the miraculous power of God that feeds us every day. We must not take for granted the prodigality of the world with food. We must have food. Don't take it for granted. And as for the wine, well, I've been in the Napa Valley, and you seem to see nothing but vineyards. Every year, God uses sunshine and soil and a plant to make wine. The Bible talks about wine in the cluster, destroy it not. So the miracles of the wedding feast and the miracles of the feeding of the thousands, they're reproduced in nature every year. Perhaps you could say every day, because all over the world the seasons are different. The miracles of the new creation, Jesus walks on water. That's not a miracle of the old creation. We can't do that. We will do it one day in the new creation. He raises the dead. The miracles of the new creation are usually reversals. But there seems to be a divine economy in the miracles that God works. When Christ raises Lazarus, he didn't roll away the stone miraculously, told the people to do it. When he called Lazarus forth, he didn't make the cloth from his face disappear by miracle. He asked the people to do it. Unbind him, let him go. When he raises the daughter of Jairus, next thing he says is, give us something to eat. There seems to be an economy of miracle when Christ works them. So the point I'm making is every miracle of Christ falls into a category by the miracles of the old creation, what we see all around us on a worldwide scale, the harvest, the vintage. or a miracle of the new creation, like the resurrection, yet to come. Very unlike the miracles in storybooks, like Grimm's fairy tales, where men turn into trees and ships become goddesses and trees talk and magic rings make feasts in the desert. The Bible miracles are altogether different from that. Well, what about this 2,000 years? The beginning of the story, Jesus tests Philip. Philip only sees the problem. Hey, I'm like that all the time. After I've agonised over a problem for a day or two or three, or an hour or two or three, then I pray about it. That's not the right way. I should pray about it immediately. But we're like Philip. We see the problem and it eclipses Jesus. That's very, very sad. If we could remember what Colin has just told us, we needn't make that mistake. So Philip is tested. He only sees the problem. Philip represents you. Philip represents me. Then Thomas comes along, and Thomas only looks at the resources. A few bread rolls, a couple of sardines. And that's our other mistake. When I get into trouble, I say, well, how can I cope with this thing? And only after I've agonised for considerable time do I think, well, I ought to pray about that. We have a very sinful nature. My experience, I think, is probably the same as yours. When God does something really great for us, perhaps we've had cancer and we're healed. Perhaps we're without money and money has come. Perhaps we've lost someone near to us and then miraculously we find they're still alive. You know what happens when something great like that comes to us? I say to myself, I'll never doubt God again. Look what He's done. Never again will I doubt. I keep my promise until the next problem. And then my promise goes out the window. It's a bit like when I was crossing from England to USA on the Saxonia, a week's trip, and it was storm all the way, and I was frustrated. Here we were paying for this boat trip and I couldn't eat the food. That's terrible. They were tying down everything on the deck of the ship. Our children played in our cabin. Their mother and father were agonising in the bunks. And I said to myself, if ever I get to land again, I'll never complain about anything. And I kept the promise until I got to land. Yeah. So here's Thomas. He just looks at the reserves and he says, what's this about among so many? Listen, life is constantly like that. For every Christian, life is a matter of recurring trials so that we might learn to trust God and realise our own weakness, which is what Colin so nicely, so well explained to us this morning. So Philip looks at the problem. Thomas looks at the resources. They're my problems. That's what I do. Then Jesus takes the bread. And now we have something that anticipates the Lord's Supper. It's almost the same words. He takes the word, he looks up, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it out. Because here is a symbol of Calvary. Here the bread of life is broken. And remember, he says at the Lord's Supper, this is my body which is broken for you. The breaking of the bread represent the nailing of his limbs to the cross, the breaking of his life from him. So the very first thing that Jesus does after he's told them to sit down, it was a desert place, but this was spring, and in spring there's plenty of green grass. But that's not the thing to remember. The thing to remember is wherever Jesus is, there is spring. Wherever Jesus is, there is spring. The thief on the cross, who was penitent, he learned that wherever Jesus was, there was paradise. Too often I just look at the problems within and without, and I forget him. But where Jesus is, there is spring. There's life. There's vitality. There's joy where Jesus is. So he makes them sit down. He doesn't want any crowds treading on one another. And they've been standing all day. He's preached them all day. And he breaks the bread and he gives it to his disciples. And it multiplies in his hands. The whole New Testament emphasises the real multiplication comes by subtraction. As Jesus gave bread away, more multiplied in his hands. He augmented things by division. I don't know whether you've heard of Count Zinzendorf, the pioneer Moravian. When he was just at school, he formed a little club called the Order of the Mustard Seed. Something very, very tiny. They were only kids, but they grew up to be the Moravian Brotherhood who went to Greenland, to Africa, all through Europe, across to England, contact John Wesley, lead to his conversion. Began with a little boy, Count Zinzendorf. He learnt to give. Though he was an aristocrat, had wealth, he learnt to give. And the way to get is to give. John Bunyan tells a story of a man who had a big roll of cloth, and every now and again as he moved among poor people, he'd unroll some of it, cut it off and give it. Then Bunyan says, there was a man who people called him mad, but the more he gave, the more he had. The more he gave, the more he had. New Testament says, give and it'll be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and flowing over, that you always, having all sufficiency in all good things, might abound to all good works. We have to give as Jesus gave, as the little boy gave. Our Bible talks about a boy with the loaves and fishes. The Greek says a little boy. Jesus never despised the little. The tears of Moses that lead to the great Redeemer of Israel. The little maid that led Naaman to the prophet. The widow's mite, which has brought cataracts of wealth into the gospel coffers. Jesus always noticed the little things. And we've got to learn to give and to give and to give, because God has promised if you give, it'll be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and running over, that you may abound to every good work. We own nothing. We lent energy and health. We lent talents. We lent special gifts, some in this area, some in others. Whatever we have is only lent us, and only for a little time. There are 1,000 doors to death. I can't be sure of tomorrow. 7,000 people a day in USA go into hospital because of car accidents. In this country, about 2,000 die every year from car accidents. Life is a very tenuous affair, and I must use it while I have it. I must use it to the glory of God, remembering that I multiply by subtracting, I augment by division, as Jesus did when he gave away to his disciples, and the food multiplied as he did so. John Wesley said, do all the good you can, in all the ways you can, by all the means you can, to every person you can, in every place you can, for as long as you can. Hey, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Do all the good you can, all the ways you can, all the means you can, to every person you can, in every place you can, for as long as you can. That's why we're here. If life is a matter of cafeteria style, self-service, we've got no right to be here. We might as well be dead. How much better will the world be when I'm gone? When you're gone? What will we have done? What will we be glad about on Judgment Day as we review our few years down here? Well, let's go back to the 2,000 years. I seem to be taking 2,000 years to get there. The breaking of the loaves pointed to Calvary. The disciples distributing it represent the preaching of the gospel to the world. When he goes up to the mountain, because he's a priest, that represents his ascension to heaven after Calvary. He goes up, and the record says he went up to a mountain. There he intercedes for the disciples. There he prays. So that represents his heavenly ascension, his reign in heaven. We need to think a lot about Jesus, his dying for us, his resurrection, his ascension, but also his reign in heaven and his coming again. But in this story, after he breaks the bread, Calvary, symbol of that, after the disciples have distributed it, the gospel going to the world, he goes up to heaven between the two. He's ascending there as our high priest. And the disciples, they're on the tossing sea. If you go through the catacombs of Rome, as some of you have done and I have done, here and there you'll see a ship, because the early Christians, a ship was a sign of the church. And the early Christians always remembered the time when the disciples, fretting because Jesus wouldn't accept kingship, God sent them something else to think about. You know, big troubles are like cannibals. They eat up all the little troubles. I can worry about a splinter until I break a limb or something. Big troubles are cannibals. They eat up all the little ones. So God sent them a big trouble, and they thought they were going to drown. Then in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus comes down from the mountain, represents the end of the world, when his church is toiling, his church is in danger, his church may be destroyed by the tempest of the world, by the foreign elements of antagonism, satanic things that hate the church. The end of the world, the church will be greatly persecuted. And I speak not of the visible church, I speak of the invisible church. I speak about the church of the twice born. Never forget what Augustine said. The church has many that God has not, probably most. But he also said, God has many the church has not. I was saying to my friend Ross today, I think there'll be some atheists in heaven whose heart had nevertheless been touched by the Spirit of God. Because the Bible says, whoever loveth is born of God. It doesn't say whoever knows the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. It doesn't say anyone who prays all day. It says whoever loveth is born of God. And there are atheists who love, because without their understanding it, without them knowing why, their hearts have been touched by the Spirit of God. And they've said unselfishness is better than selfishness. Love is better than hatred. Truth is better than a lie. Giving is better than selfishness. So the true church, the church of the twice born, will be greatly persecuted at the end of time. Jesus said that. Time will come, he said, when they'll persecute you. They'll cast you out of the synagogues. Whoever kills you will think he's doing God's service. And he says a lot on that in Matthew 24 about the last days. And in that same passage he says, the love of thee many, that's the way it is in the Greek, love of thee many will wax cold. In other words, most of the professing church will go to the wall. Never depend on a church. Depend on Jesus. The disciples in that boat represent the Christian church through the centuries, tossed by storm and flood, and particularly at the end of time, when according to Revelation 13, there'll be a final attack on the church. Not only Revelation 13, Revelation 11 tells the same story, and other passages. Time is coming when you risk your life if you are a Christian. Time is coming when you'll have to choose between safety and peril. But Jesus will come back at that time when it looks as though his church is being swallowed up by the vicious elements of the world, represented by the stormy waters, which often in the Bible are used as a symbol of satanic enemies. So when his church is about to be swallowed up at the end of time, Jesus will come down from the mountain. He will come down from heaven. And when he comes down, it says immediately the ship was at the land. When he comes down, the storm is over. When he comes down, the trial is ended. When he comes down, we're no longer tossed up and down. When he comes down, our fears are over. When he comes down and he's with us, then the ship is at the shore. Eternal life for the true church.
To help you understand God's Word in a whole new way, go to goodnewsunlimited.com. You can sign up there to get your free devotional delivered to you each day. This program has been paid for by the partners and friends of Good News Unlimited. Word spreads fast.